Giant white polar mountain goat. Medium gray Arctic pika. Giant snowy polar yak. Small white Arctic musk ox. Medium snowy Arctic ibex. Giant white polar caribou. Medium white polar ice weasel. Medium white Arctic moose. Giant white polar snow leopard. Giant silver Arctic yak. Medium silver Arctic polar bison. Tiny frosted Arctic mountain goat. Giant frosted Arctic hare. Small snowy polar yak. Large white polar snow leopard. Small white Arctic musk ox. Medium snowy Arctic polar bear. Medium white polar Arctic hare. Tiny snowy polar reindeer. Giant white polar reindeer. Large snowy Arctic marmot.
Small snowy Arctic caribou.
Giant white Arctic polar bear. Giant frosted Arctic snow leopard. Tiny snowy polar Arctic wolf. Giant frosted Arctic wolf. Giant gray Arctic caribou. Giant gray polar pika. Giant snowy polar Arctic fox. Tiny snowy Arctic yak. Medium snowy Arctic caribou. Giant silver Arctic fox.
Small white Arctic mountain goat.
Large gray polar caribou. Giant icy Arctic ice weasel. Large white polar marmot. Giant icy Arctic moose. Large snowy Arctic glacier lynx. Tiny frosted Arctic yak.
Small white Arctic snow martin. Large gray polar Arctic fox.
Large snowy polar mountain goat.
Giant silver Arcto ice weasel.
Large snowy Arctic moose.
Large gray polar Arctic fox.
Medium snowy Arctic pika. Small gray polar glacier lynx. Tiny icy Arctic musk ox. Large gray polar ice weasel. Medium snowy Arctic marmot.
Medium silver Arctic pika.
Tiny snowy Arctic reindeer. Giant gray Arctic pika. Small snowy Arctic ice weasel.
Tiny white polar snow marten.
Giant gray Arctic lemming. Small silver Arcar. Tiny frosted Arctic caribou. Medium white Arctic snow marten. Large gray polar pika. Small snowy Arctic pika. Medium gray polar Arctic moose. Large gray polar Arctic wolf. Tiny silver polar snow marten. Large snowy Arctic snow leopard. Tiny white Arctic pika. Giant snowy polar caribou. Small snowy polar Arctic fox. Large white polar marmot. Small gray polar Arctic fox. Small white Arctic mountain goat. Tiny silver polar wolverine. Large gray polar bear. Small snowy Arctic moose.
Tiny snowy polar Arctic fox.
Tiny, icy Arctic polar bison. Tiny, white Arctic polar bison. Large silver Arctic fox. Giant gray polar ice weasel. Small white Arctic glacier lynx. Medium gray Arctic caribou. Large white Arctic ice weasel.
Medium white Arctic marmot.
Tiny frosted Arctic yak.
Tiny, icy Arctic snow leopard.
Medium snowy polar Arctic fox. Medium gray Arctic marmot. Large gray polar Arctic hare. Large silver Arctic reindeer. Large icy Arctic fox. Large gray polar lemming. Medium snowy Arctic yak. Tiny frosted Arctic snow marten. Giant gray polar glacier lynx. Tiny silver Arctic yak. Giant snowy polar bison. Large snowy Arctic yak. Giant silver Arctic lemming. Giant frosted Arctic pika. Tiny icy Arctic glacier lynx. Medium gray Arctic polar bear. Small gray Arctic polar bear. Tiny white polar Arctic moose. Large gray Arctic musk ox. Large snowy polar snow leopard. Tiny silver polar snow marten. Giant snowy Arctic wolverine. Small white Arctic reindeer. Small white Arctic ibex. Medium gray polar Arctic wolf. Large snowy polar mountain goat. Medium gray Arctic ibex. Large silver Arctic lemming.
Small silver polar wolverine.
Medium gray polar Arctic wolf.
Small, snowy. Fuck.
Large snowy polar bear. Large icy Arctic musk ox. Giant icy Arctic musk ox. Tiny white polar Arctic moose. Small white Arctic caribou. Medium silver Arctic polar bison. Tiny snowy polar yak. Giant gray Arctic musk ox. Large wild boar. Tiny snowy Arctic ice weasel. Medium gray Arctic reindeer. Small white Arctic polar bison. Large snowy polar Arctic fox. Small snowy polar glacier lynx. Giant frosted Arctic ibex. Small silver polar Arctic moose. Giant gray polar bison. Giant gray Arctic wolverine. Giant gray Arctic pika. Medium snowy polar bear. Giant icy Arctic snow leopard. Medium gray polar mountain goat. Giant snowy Arctic yak. Giant white polar caribou. Large gray Arctic musk ox. Tiny snowy Arctic musk ox.
Medium snowy polar lemming.
Tiny silver Arctic pika.
Large gray polar snow leopard.
Medium silver Arctic yak. Small white Arctic snow marten. Giant white polar Arctic wolf. Giant snowy Arctic glacier lynx. Medium silver Arctic yak. Giant white polar glacier lynx. Large snowy polar Arctic wolf. Medium gray polar Arctic fox. Giant icy Arctic wolf. Giant white polar bear. Giant silver Arctic polar bison. Tine white Arctic wolf. Giant snowy Arctic pika. Giant snowy polar Arctic fox. Small white Arctic. Tiny frosted Arctic yak. Tynan silver polar ice weasel. Giant gray polar caribou. Medium gray polar musk ox. Tiny frosted Arctic polar bison. Giant gray polar Arctic hare. Giant snowy polar pika. Small white Arctic muskox. Medium gray Arctic musk ox. Large icy Arctic wolf. Large white Arctic polar bison. Large snowy polar musk ox. Small silver Arctic wolverine. Giant gray polar caribou. Large white Arctic ibex. Giant white polar snow leopard.
Tiny white Arctic pika.
Small gray polar caribou. Tine silver polar Arctic wolf. Tiny silver polar mountain goat. Medium gray polar yak. Tiny white Arctic polar bear. Large frosted Arctic wolf. Giant frosted Arctic marmot. Small white Arctic caribou. Small snowy Arctic reindeer.
Small white Arctic wolf.
Large gray polar ice weasel. Small silver Arctic wolverine. Medium snowy Arctic marmot.
Large wild. Medium snowy Arctic musk ox.
Medium white polar glacier lynx. Small white Arctic musk ox. Medium gray polar ibex. Tiny silver Arctic polar bear. Small snowy Arctic muskox.
Large silver Arctic fox.
Giant silver Arctic pika.
Small white Arctic wolverine.
Large snowy polar ibex.
Small silver Arcar.
Giant snowy Arctic polar bison.
Tiny silver Arctic caribou.
Giant gray polar bison.
Tiny frosted Arctic caribou.
Medium snowy polar mountain goat.
Tiny gray polar Arctic fox. Small snowy polar caribou. Small gray Arctic wolf. Medium white Arctic fox.
Large silver Arctic yak.
Tiny gray Arctic ibex.
Small snowy polar yak.
Tiny frosted Arctic glacier lynx.
Medium white Arctic ibex.